Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Lucinda Vakura, the Business Development and Marketing Director with the Alford Group. I know many of you are familiar with our firm, but for those of you who may not be, the Alford Group is a national full-service consulting firm specializing in the nonprofit and social sectors. So we offer services in fundraising, strategic planning, corporate partnership strategy, data analytics, and much more. And really our goal is to provide guidance, tools, and structures that empower organizations to have the greatest impact possible. Of course, there's more information about us on our website, which is alford.com. On behalf of the entire team here, welcome to our third webinar in our 40th anniversary webinar series. There's one more webinar in the series, which is on Thursday actually, and all of the webinars that we've been hosting are free and they're posted on our website. I'll speak more to that at the end of today's presentation. So today's webinar and panel discussion is titled Diversity, Rewiring Your Donor Engagement Strategies. And moderating today's conversation is Brenda Asari, President and CEO of the Alford Group. Since joining the firm over a decade ago, she has partnered with clients to raise over $2 billion in creating game-changing results that are fueling these organizations' visions. Prior to the Alford Group, Brenda served as the Chief Development Officer with the American Red Cross. So before I hand it over to Brenda, I just have a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is approved for 1 CFRE credit point for anyone who's seeking CFRE certification or recertification. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll have a recording available for you after the event along with the slide deck. So no need to take notes, we'll send you the slide deck. And actually, please look out for an email later today with both of those things, as well as a short survey just asking for your feedback. Everyone joining us today is in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. You'll be able to hear our panelists. We will not be able to hear the audience as everyone is muted because we have a lot of people on the line. However, we will have time at the end to take questions. So if you have a question at any time during the webinar, simply type your question using the chat function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A at the end of today's session. And then lastly, we invite you to join us on Twitter throughout the webinar using the hashtag NPOStrength. So that's NPOStrength. We'll be live tweeting and invite you to join the conversation there as well. So with that, those are my housekeeping items, and I'm going to turn things over to Brenda to kick us off for today's webinar.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Diversity, Rewiring Your Donor Engagement Strategies. America is in the midst of dramatic cultural shift. More ethnically and racially diverse, it is more important than ever to overhaul our playbook. As nonprofit leaders, we should be asking ourselves, do our current fundraising efforts reach the full spectrum of people who might support us? Are we speaking their language in literal and figurative ways? Do the fundraising channels and vehicles exclude some potential groups of donors? Today, we are going to take a look at some data points that address these questions, and then hear who will share their perspective. The entire universe of donors. Whites are overrepresented compared to donors of color. This demographic picture looks more like the racial and ethnic makeup of America in 1990 than that of our country today. The underrepresentation of donors of color suggests that nonprofits do not understand the value, potential, or importance of non-white donor communities. Fundraising in the 21st century will require a differentiated approach to the interests, values, and traditions of the many, rather than just a one-size-fits-all approach. When we dig deeper into some of the trends impacting philanthropy, we see urgency and why diversity and inclusion matter. One of the major trends that we have seen over the past 3 years is the significant decrease in households participating in philanthropy. It will only be a matter of time before the holes in the bucket, so to speak, continue to increase and grow larger. In order to grow the top line, there needs to be more donors in the mix. Continued efforts to migrate donors and to move relationships from, as people of color become majorities across communities in our nation, successful nonprofits will need to have a diverse donor base of color. We were able to find information compiled from public and private and commercial data sets. This data shared were over 2.2 million households comprised of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, all with a net worth of $250,000 to over $10 million. We know that they all give. It's just a matter of how we engage them. Let's spend a few minutes looking at a snapshot of some of our key ethnic donors of color. The donors that we're taking a look at today are comprised of African American, Asian, and Hispanics. And the reason we're focused on these three larger groups is because this is where we have the bulk of the research to date. Research around diverse donor giving is nascent at this point. There's very little research out there. It's just becoming a topic of interest where more and more community foundations, large research institutions like Indiana University, they're just now turning their attention to the importance of diverse giving and the importance of people of community, how they contribute to our country's philanthropic endeavors. So the first snapshot we're going to take a look at is the African American donor community. Here you can see that is dominated by females. What we also know when we look at the giving habits and motivations from African American philanthropists, we see where religion dominates. African Americans donate to their place of worship more than any other nonprofit category. When we take a look at their giving habits and attitudes, 45% of African American philanthropists report that they like supporting organizations by participants, parties, and walks. 57% feel it is their responsibility to support organizations which positively impact people in the African American community. 66% of African American philanthropists are more likely to give in large and small ways. They tend to give at a higher proportion to toy drives, food drives, also donations at the grocery store. We also found from the research that African Americans receive fewer requests to donate, 6.2 asks per month compared to 7.3 asks per month for donors overall. One of the pullouts from the research is 1 out of 5 African Americans says he or she would support more organizations if asked more often. So again, we're leaving money on the table. And we're going to talk more about some of the perceptions and assumptions that we have in the marketplace relative to donors of color. Our snapshot of the Asian donor philanthropist community, we see that is heavily dominated by female, 60%. We also see, when we take a look at Asian donors, that they tend to give to health, children, and social services. Religion typically is not in their top 3 giving priorities. Asian philanthropists are 40% time more likely to visit a nonprofit's website. So when we look at their giving habits and attitudes, very planful, very research-oriented. Asians are less likely to give to causes that make a difference by changing policies or laws. We also see that nearly half of Asians are more likely to support a friend or family's request for a donation. So again, very, very much relational based as we look at Asian giving and looking at what are some of their motivations. We also find that Asian philanthropists tend to be younger, well-educated, likely more liberal and female. When we take a look at the Hispanic philanthropists, one of the key differences we see here is very male-oriented in terms of where philanthropy is coming from, 57%. We also know from the Hispanic giving community that their place of worship is oftentimes cited first among their giving priorities. They are somewhat less likely to give to health. 52% give spontaneously and based on who is making the ask and also what pulls at their hearts. So again, very emotional. We know in the research, when we take a look at what motivates donors, we know that there's the rational case for support as well as the emotional. But we see from the research studies that Hispanic philanthropists are very much driven by relationships and also by emotions in terms of the meaning and the impact relative to the dollars that they're donating. 21% of the Hispanic donors interviewed indicated that they would support more nonprofits, but they don't know how. And this is really an opportunity for our nonprofit organizations to really put in place what we call a more expansive definition of philanthropy. I've been in philanthropy for the bulk of my career, and we all have talked about time, talent, and treasure. Well, there's a 4th T, and that's testimony. And so as we look at ways for these communities to now collectively use their voices to create impact, that impact is just as important as the dollars, time, and talent that our communities of color are bringing to the table. We also see from Hispanic donors that they're more likely to support campaigns where a portion of the sales go toward supporting a specific cause. So again, looking at fundraising platforms like Amazon Smile, they tend to have a higher propensity to give to those kinds of platforms. Also, Hispanic donors are less likely to make online donations. And I think, again, that goes back to the very relational nature of how they approach philanthropy and also being generous. More than half of Hispanics say that they prefer appeals in English. And I know when I was leading development office 15 plus years ago, that was always a discussion relative to language and should we have our marketing materials printed in English as well as in Spanish. This is generational. We certainly see still in many communities of color that as we look at some of the generational differences, that we still need to be cognizant of those donors who are more comfortable with English and those who are more comfortable with their native language. I'd like to now turn to our panel, because I really think this is the meat of why we're here today. And I'm so thankful that our panel agreed to be a part of this discussion. It's one thing to have the data, it's another to have it be validated by real life experience in terms of how these philanthropists are approaching philanthropy. And again, I want to remind us that no group is monolithic. So hopefully one of the things that you will hear as a part of our discussion today are some of the forces, some of the similarities. Where are we seeing some intersection between the research and donors of color, as well as where are we seeing variances? So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Denitra Griffin. Dr. Griffin is co-owner, executive vice president for AGB Investigative Services, one of the fastest growing businesses in the United States. She also serves as the CEO of its charitable arms, the AGB Institute and the Always Giving Back Foundation. The Always Giving Back Foundation provides inspiration, access, and life-changing opportunities to Chicago's minority youth and underserved Chicago communities, while the AGB Institute focuses on transforming the lives of adults through education and personal development. Dr. Griffin currently sits on a number of boards: the Always Giving Back Foundation, National Lewis University PACE Advisory Board, Jack and Jill of America Windy City Chapter Executive Board, AKA Chi Omega Chapter Executive Board, immediate past local school council chair of Brooks College Preparatory High School, board member for African-American Legacy Fund. She has received many recognitions for her commitment to service. She was recognized as the first person in Chicago to host a Feed My Starving Children event that packed over 100,000 meals for children in Haiti. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Dr. Griffin. Our next panelist, David Jimenez, is a principal in the Hartford, Connecticut office of the national law firm Jackson Lewis. David is the co-chair of the firm's Corporate Governance and Internal Investigations Practice Group. David is a well-known writer and much sought-after speaker. He is also the president of the board of directors of the Hartford Stage Company, a premier, nationally acclaimed theater, which with Tony Award-winning productions to his credit. He is a former trustee of the Mark Twain House and Museum, a national historic hallmark in Hartford, Connecticut, where he served on the management committee of the board. He is also a past president and board member of the Hartford County Bar Foundation. Thank you, David, for joining us. Last but not least, Joanne Yoshimoto. Joanne began her nonprofit career in 1977 and has served continuously as staff, board member, and/or donor ever since. Known for her ready smile and engaging personality, Joanne is a world traveler. She brings a diverse and inclusive lens to her work with the Alford Group as a senior consultant and also to her relationships. Thank you, Joanne, for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to open our questions up to the panel with this first question. As you reflect on the data points from the research, what resonated? Where did you see points of variances? Dr. Griffin?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. The data speaks truth to a lot of the ways we give in the African American community. And so what I found that resonates particularly with me was the fact that religion being the highest percentage of venue on how we donate. And I reflected on why that number is as high as it is. And because the church and education has really served as a hub for the growth and development of African Americans, that is clearly one of the many ways that we extend ourselves and give back. We kind of hold the concept as a sense of obligation because of the experiences and the value it has added to our lives. That is our way of giving back. Now, however, I think it's worth mentioning as we look at the data that was mentioned for Gen X and millennials, and even as I think about the Gen Zers that are forthcoming, that traditional religion concept is shifting a little bit. And so although the largest percentage right now are the boomers, if we're planning 10 years out, we want to start thinking about what's important for our Gen X millennials and Gen Zers. Because religion, the traditional church or place of worship setting has declined over the years. Yeah. And so younger people are looking for a way to extend their social giving and, show value in other areas.
Thank you. David?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and hats off to the Alford Group for putting this on. I think that, to the extent that development is interested in pursuing these groups, that we have to balance the desire not to stereotype, but at the same time to maybe simplify and take some of the mystery out of these various groups. And so as I think about the Hispanic community, I'm mindful of the fact that that really includes many different cultures, and I want to be very respectful that I not over stereotype. But I am as I think about what I reflect on from the research, or what really sort of brought my attention, the fact that there's a degree of male dominance in the giving in Hispanic communities is not surprising to me. And I think that's something to be considered in terms of how ASK are organized. The fact that much of the Hispanic giving goes to extended families and to church organizations rings very true to me. I believe that Hispanics as a culture are very giving and very likely to share, but it typically is in an informal way with people who have some familiarity or some sort of connection to the giving unit. I also can relate to the fact that there is a great deal of focus on education. I think in the Hispanic community at large, education is seen as a key to mobility, to economic advancement, and there's just a great deal of emphasis on that from a very, very early age. And I noticed also that there seems to be a lack of knowledge about how to give, and I can relate to that only in the sense that, beyond giving within the family circle, that the notion of giving to organizations was not common in my experience growing up. And now, as a board member on a number of organizations, I have witnessed that firsthand, that when we have successfully connected with certain Hispanics, that we may be the first organization to connect with that donor, and so the process of development and giving is new to that individual, and so I think there's a lot of work that could be done there. But perhaps the biggest sort of experience that I have taken away in my past few years serving on boards is that programming is very important. In other words, being in a cultural or in an arts institution, it is incredibly important, in my view, for the donor community to see that there is programming and educational programs that are relevant to the Hispanic community, and that brings in potential donors, and it creates a degree of excitement and connection. And that that sort of dovetails with one of the research findings about the fact that in the Hispanic community, donations have a degree of emotional connection, or they're associated with some kind of an emotional connection. I see that happen, and I often see a heightened amount of emotion whenever the organizations I'm associated with deliver something that is very meaningful to the Hispanic community. I see a great deal of excitement. I see tears and enthusiasm from donors about what can they do to participate, but it has to be relevant to their community. At least that has been my experience.
Terrific. You know, David, when you talk about informal philanthropy, one of the things, unfortunately, that is not captured as a part of our annual report out from our Giving USA data would be any of the informal giving that happens in and across communities of color. We know that it is happening. We've not yet figured out a way to get our arms around it, because if we were to look at, you know, over $450 billion was donated in 2018. And we can only imagine what philanthropy would look like if we were able to include the generosity of much of the informal giving that goes on across communities of color. So again, it begs the question relative to expansion and expanding our definition of philanthropy, and not have it fit so neatly in a box, and have it just reflect only what we call organized philanthropy. Joanne, your reflections?
Yes, I'm going to open my comments by issuing a bit of a disclaimer here. You know, I'm just one voice in a large population that is represented under the banner of Asian Americans. I also want to point out that people of Asian origin in America represent 30 to 40 countries of origin, as well as various ethnic groups and many, many languages. So, you know, generalizations are useful only to a degree. So with that, I'm going to address some of the statistics that were uncovered by the recent research. What caught my attention first was the preponderance of female philanthropists in the Asian community. And as I reflect on families that I know and individuals that I know, I can see where that may be true. But I want to caution fundraisers out there against making assumptions and maybe always deferring or frequently deferring to the female in a couple. You know, if you have an opportunity to engage both partners of a couple in a conversation about philanthropy, I would encourage you to do so. You may get to a deeper understanding of that family and its decision-making process with regard to philanthropy. The other point that popped out at me is the preponderance of, or the proclivity to go to a website to research an organization before getting involved. And I have to say, I felt like I was looking in the mirror, because I would not think of getting involved with an organization without doing some research so that I'm more informed than just what friends, or certainly more than a brochure, might tell me about an organization. There was another point that Brenda mentioned that kind of stood out to me: the lack of interest compared to other ethnic groups in policies, laws, and this is something that personally, maybe I'm bucking the trend there, but I have just been so impacted by individuals who have told me, Joanne, philanthropy is a drop in the bucket compared to public funding, public policies, and law, to the extent that they made me feel like if I want to be a well-rounded philanthropist, then I absolutely have to be involved in advocacy as well as outright philanthropy. And then there was one more point that resonated with me. Religion is not as important in Asian American communities. And I have found this to be true, but I would say in individual cases where there is a religious affiliation, it tends to be quite strong as an influencer of behavior and philanthropy.
Thank you, Joanne. I really appreciate your comments. You know, when you talk about the influence of advocacy and we think about the expanded definition of testimony and the important impact that it can create for an organization, I just see so many organizations investing more in advocacy, especially organizations serving people of color, and they're struggling with trying to engage those donors with, and oftentimes those clients in terms of how can they make a meaningful contribution to their organization. So that whole area of advocacy, I think, is one that is rising to the surface where there's a place for every voice. I'd like to just turn our attention a little bit to assumptions. Both you and David both alluded to the diversity within the diversity of your communities. And I'd like to just kind of touch on what are some of the assumptions that you see laid out there or exist in this sector relative to giving and involvement of donors of color. I mean, have you encountered assumptions that were just kind of off base or shocking, or you were just surprised that people still thought that way as related to engaging you as a philanthropist and as a board leader?
Well, yes, I'll take a shot at it. You know, I can't say that I've been shocked by the assumption that all Hispanic donors might behave in the same way. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it play out in that way. To the extent I've seen that kind of an assumption, it's not with giving or with philanthropic norms as much as it is other things like the language or the culture, the food. I mean, there are distinct differences. There are distinct differences of holidays. There's distinct differences of you know, what is done as a family member or as families, and you know, it also depends where you are in the country. I mean, there are assumptions if you're in the Northeast that Hispanic backgrounds tend to be Puerto Rican, or Texas and California tends to be the assumption is that you're of Mexican background. So I've seen those kind of assumptions. I can't say, Brenda, that I've seen that sort of work its way into assumptions about development, but I would just caution that if you have the first, it might impede the latter, and so you just want to be aware of that fact. And recently we had discussion in one of the organizations about doing something around a holiday that, you know, upon further research, we found that it was really more of a Mexican holiday, but not celebrated by the Puerto Rican traditions. And in Hartford, Connecticut, where I live, the Puerto Rican community is much larger. And so you can see how if we had developed that kind of programming specific to that kind of a holiday, only celebrated by Mexican heritage, it may not have played well. In fact, would have been viewed as quite ignorant on behalf of this organization.
Wow. That's a huge sensitivity that many organizations really don't know what those fine strands are, David. And so again, it goes back to educating. I want to follow up on the question on the assumption piece. Sometimes I hear things like many of the organizations that we work with are very much aware of diversity, and they want to do more. They want to be a more active player and have their boards reflect the community and the potential. But oftentimes I hear things like, well, should we recruit, you know, one person of color? Are they going to be lonely if they don't have another person of color on the board with them? Don't they know all the African-American people in Chicago or all the Hispanic people in Hartford, Connecticut? So I'd like to respond to that in terms of, have you heard those kinds of assumptions where they think, you know, you can't be alone And it's better if they recruit in pairs.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And undoubtedly there is, I think at times, well-intended efforts to bring in diverse board members and diverse constituents to an organization with that in mind, that they will help perhaps bring others. And you know, I'm a big believer in diversifying boards for a variety of reasons, but I believe it has to be, you know, a true legitimate effort to diversify the organization beyond just mere, you know, window dressing. Because if it's purely that, you know, that individual may find himself or herself to be somewhat on an island and not fully integrated, perhaps not feeling like this is their organization or their board, and therefore not as aligned with the mission and so on. So I think it has to be a comprehensive effort to not only diversify the board, but or the organization in one form or another, but to embrace that diversity and make the organization more inclusive. And it is true, I believe it's true anyway, and I've seen it play out, that if you attract diverse board members or diverse staff, that they perhaps can be a gateway to their respective communities. But they could also bring a whole lot of other things to the table, and that may or may not be, recruiting others may or may not be their thing. And so the assumption that if I bring one in, that'll solve my problem, or we'll bring in others, is not always true. And I'm probably an example of that. I am of Hispanic background, and my parents are from Costa Rica. I am not of the Puerto Rican community here in Hartford. So if that assumption were made about me and the organizations I joined, they would very soon find out that my connections to the community here in Hartford are limited. So I think it's a good point, Brenda, that you bring up, and I think it's about being, you know, cautious and respectful and taking the time to learn about the different elements and the different cultures that make up whatever demographic, whether it's Hispanic or Asian or other communities.
Right. Dr. Griffin, any thoughts from you?
Yes, I guess I'm actually thinking about in response to David's statement and really taking the time to learn. I just think that's sometimes undervalued, and don't be fearful to ask someone to just be kind of serve as an ad hoc advisory thought partner with you. I think in our different communities, we're very open and we want to share our nuances that exist within our own minority group, the diversity that exists within thought, within behavior. And so really be open to soliciting someone as a thought partner and be clear with that intent up front. I'm coming as a learner. This will add value to my approach, and I'm certain they will be willing to share.
You know, Dr. Griffin, that's such a pointed comment. The terminology, and we spoke to the language, both literal and figurative language, which is really, really important. You know, we have so many labels. I think sometimes one of the reasons that this thought partnership doesn't happen is I think people just they're not comfortable with the language. Sometimes they don't know the language. So I think being able to have the courage to ask for time to sit with a donor of color and really say, you know, I really want to understand, you know, David, you know, most people wouldn't know the difference from, you know, Puerto Rican, from Latin America, and they just don't know. And I think for our folks on the phone, again, I just want to emphasize, ask, and just fess up and say, I just don't know and I want to learn. Because I want to get it right. And so I find that people tend to be quiet because they just don't know how to ask the question.
I agree with you. I think it has to be an honest conversation about what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah.
One thing that sort of strikes me too, this sort of goes back to your question about reflecting on the research, but in relation to what we're talking about right now, I think it's true, and maybe you can prove me wrong on this, but I think that when we're talking about these potential donor communities, there's also limited research of the kind that you have put on display here, whereas in other communities, I would submit maybe there's a lot more research and a lot more history of giving to study, and so there's less mystery.
Yeah.
And so the limited information that's available on the internet, I think, and other resources really requires honest conversation. Where donor heads of development in the philanthropic business need to feel comfortable reaching out and saying, "Tell me about your community. Tell me about what's the best way to connect and to make these asks and to engage with that community." I think the Hispanic community that I'm familiar with and that I've interacted with over the last 20 or so years would be surprised and would welcome being invited to that conversation.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Joanne?
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back to your original question about is it better to recruit in pairs or what have you. I just am so happy to share. Well, I am willing to share that I have been in so many different settings, the only person of color in an organization that had as one of its organizational priorities to diversify. And so I can't tell you the number of times I've been in a conversation around the table. As soon as the word diversity is mentioned, all eyes would look at me as if I have some kind of pearl of wisdom that is going to, solve their organizational dilemma. So absolutely, it's better to recruit a couple of people of color, but even better than that is to really institutionalize the effort around diversity so that you have so many people around the table that you can't look at any one or even two when the topic comes up. One of the happy experiences I've had is to be associated with an organization that was predominantly white at the start. And there was a very intentional effort toward diversifying the board. Well, let's just focus on the board for now. And within a matter of a couple years, it was wonderfully diverse. It was amazingly diverse. I think they had exceeded their own expectations. So to Denitra's point, just reach out and ask people, and you'll be surprised, and you'll learn a lot, and you'll have good success.
I'd like to, Denitra, you touched on your family. As you look at Gen Xers and millennials, how are you involving your children in philanthropy? We hear this a lot from our more experienced philanthropists. They're always asking organizations to make room for the next generation. So what are you doing to engage your children in this whole scene of philanthropy?
Great, thanks for asking. Philanthropy is just a way of life for us. Even as you look at the name of our business, AGB stands for Always Giving Back. And so we raised our children to understand, even as young individuals in school, we would always ask them, how are you making the world a better place? So having those ongoing conversations in the most simplistic, general messages so that they understand, as you are here to create and generate wealth for yourself, you have a responsibility to give and serve others in that process. And so it has become part of our way of life. And so we ask our children, we established our foundation, and each child has a scholarship in their name. So they are responsible for raising money so that they can give to others towards their education. And even outside, while they were on their college campuses, it is always encouraged to join a service organization. You can do whatever you want, but join a service organization. It is a requirement. And so with those just being our general conversations, just part of our natural habits and behaviors, my oldest son is now on a board as an adult. He knows he has a responsibility to serve, and it is expected that you find something of interest and you serve on that board. And so what I've learned quickly on was that it is expected in the Caucasian community, just generally speaking. That's why we see so many young people who are non-minorities serving on boards at a young age. It is part of their expectation. And I want to make sure that my children are aware of that expectation as well.
Thank you. David, Joanne, any reflection in terms of how you're engaging your family in philanthropy?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't have such an impressive track record as Dr. Griffin there. I will say that the church has been sort of the introduction to giving for my three kids. Church and other sort of charitable causes was sort of the early introduction. And as they've gotten older, they have participated increasingly and sometimes to sort of lead a fundraiser of sorts for one cause or another. And then I have introduced through galas and other performances. And so I do think that they have grown up seeing a formal form of giving that I never had. As I grew up, I only saw the informal type of giving that we talked about earlier. I think they are more comfortable now. They are more aware of what that's like. And to the point that Dr. Griffin raised earlier, I do see that in the because their parents and grandparents were part of this organization as well, and it just sort of continues to go on one generation to the next in terms of their alignment, commitment, financial and otherwise. And so I do think it's incumbent upon us as leaders in these communities to try to develop a similar kind of mindset that perhaps wasn't there with earlier generations that were establishing a foothold here.
Yes, great. Joanne?
Yes, I have involved my children in my philanthropy over, I would say, the last 20 or so years. But for a long time, my interest had been more almost theoretical or global in supporting global health and international development efforts. But as a third generation Japanese American, which means that my kids are fourth generation, my grandson is fifth generation, I'm finding recently an opportunity to connect the dots back to my grandparents. And that has to do with the social and political news and opinions about immigrants and refugees. As we look at, the idea of border walls and deportation, I can't help but wonder what our family would look like if my grandparents had been deported 100 years ago when they first came to America. So I find in this moment in time a very teachable moment for my family, my kids, my grandkids, even my nieces and nephews. We can relate our family history to real current events and leverage our philanthropy in support of causes that are personally meaningful, while at the same time looking at something that is bigger than us, and that's the idea of social justice.
That's great. You know, we're almost at the end of our time, and I do want to ask a question that I think, you know, that's burning on every chief development officer's mind. I mean, here we have 3 very accomplished philanthropists, and oftentimes the challenge is we all kind of chase after that one, the one where we see their name the most and we think they have the largest Rolodex of contacts. But I would like for each of you to kind of speak, when you're looking at an organization, what are you looking at in terms of an organization that you want to become connected to? First, I would imagine as a volunteer, and then secondly, as a donor, and then thirdly, as an investor. So what's drawing you into the organizations that you have the greatest passion points for at this time? Dr. Griffin?
So as a volunteer, I am definitely drawn into initiatives that are relevant to my community. That's what interests me. I honestly feel like there are gaps that exist where I I can make a difference, whether it's with finances or intelligence. So I'm connected to strategic priorities around there. You said volunteer, and how else? I'm sorry.
As a donor. I think you may have.
As a donor.
Yeah.
Yes, as a donor, the same concept applies. And it's versatile. So I know the research really talks about religion and higher ed, but we're continuing to see a great awareness around the arts. And so I am interested also as a hobby. I enjoy the arts. Younger individuals to get that same exposure around the arts.
Fantastic. Thank you. David?
Okay, so I think before I sort of segment into volunteer or donor or investor or otherwise, I think the first thing that's really important for me to engage in any capacity with organizations is an appealing, clear message that I have some excitement about. And it probably sounds simplistic and perhaps overly, there's nothing novel about that. But there are organizations that I have interacted with over the years where I haven't understood the mission, or the mission just seems unrealistic or too far reaching, or has too many multiple parts to it. So simplicity of missions to the point where I can easily relate to it and decide, is that something I'm excited about or not? I think is critically important. In terms of organizations that I tend to volunteer for, these are usually organizations where my legal skills or other sort of business acumen is relevant. And so I find that I do a lot in education and a lot in social services. I do a lot with pro bono activities, or even more simply, I'm involved with a homeless shelter and regularly get involved with the feeding of the members there. As a donor or an investor, I'm more picky, if you will, about that kind of engagement, and I want to be involved with organizations that are meaningful, have impact to the community, and I happen to believe that arts and higher education are very important, and I serve on boards that reflect that. So significant impact, and I want to be in an organization where there is a potential for leadership, so that I can contribute not only in a financial way, but also by virtue of what I can bring to the board in non-monetary ways. And so I find that if there's that mission alignment and there's that kind of appeal to me in those areas, then I'm going to be fully engaged.
Thank you. Joanne?
Yes, I definitely start by looking at alignment of the organization's mission with my own interests and evidence that they are impactful in their space. But I also look for organizations that are what I call the right size for me. They're not so big that, you know, my best efforts are just a drop in the bucket. You know, the report that we referenced looks at high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals. I would tend not to be interested in getting very involved in an organization that has a preponderance of ultra high net worth individuals, because, you know, I could donate my entire life savings and it would just be a drop in the bucket compared to what that particular population can do. But when I'm in a right-sized organization, I'll give you an example. At a fundraising breakfast, I can raise my paddle and actually challenge the group to raise a little or to dig a little deeper than they might have thought, so that I can be impactful in a strategic way.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We do have time for one question, and I would just say, if you could just give me one word, only because I want to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time. The webinar ends at 2 o'clock, but I would just say the question is, what is your hope for the future of philanthropy as you look at more and more nonprofits effectively rewiring their strategies around recruitment and engagement of diverse donors of color? What is your hope? One word. Dr. Griffin.
Oh my goodness. One word, my hope for philanthropy.
Yes.
Inclusive.
Fantastic. David?
Informed.
Joanne?
Successful.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, we have heard about informal and formal ways of approaching philanthropy, which calls for there to be a much more expansive definition of philanthropy. In communities of color, the desire to give back and create opportunities for others are strong motivators. Also, there exists a desire for communities of color to bond together in solving issues impacting their specific communities, as well as creating a bridge, an opportunity for different communities of color to work together to solve societal issues. Rewiring our strategies to become more effective in our engagement of all donors, particularly donors of color, remains one of the greatest untapped resources for solving society ills and sustaining our collective future. Philanthropy must invest in this engagement. We must build networks, consult and convene donors of color. The future of philanthropy hinges on our ability to see and connect with the America of 2019 and beyond, and not that of 1990. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our webinar. I'd like to thank our panel, Dr. Denitra Griffin, David Jimenez, Joanne Yoshimoto. I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon, for sharing your experience, your insights, and your time. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lucinda to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is part of the Alford Group's 40th anniversary webinar series. So our final webinar in the series is on Thursday, which is Halloween. So get the team together, enjoy some holiday treats while you tune in. But the final webinar in our series is titled, because it's Halloween, Don't Get Spooked, How to Create a Strong Development Plan to Drive Fundraising Success. So there's more information on our website, and you can definitely register there if you're interested in joining us on Thursday. Just a reminder to keep an eye out for an email from us later today. This will have the recording of today's webinar, the full slide deck, and a very short survey where you can give us some feedback on how we did today. If we did not have a chance to answer your question, or if you have questions in the future, please contact us. You can find us on our website, or you can email us at info@alford.com. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for participating. We hope to see you on Thursday's webinar. And this concludes today's session. So we will now disconnect, and I hope that everyone has a really great day. Take care.
Thank you.